At the beginning of January, Mad Cleaning went and they performed the arduous task of preparing all of their different budgets in order to check that the level of sales that they expected to do and the costs they expected to incur would in fact end up with them producing the amount of income that the company wanted to have for the period. And that is the planning step that every company takes at the beginning of each and every period. And then during the period, they will act upon that plan and to their best try to be the most productive business they possibly can be. But no matter how good of a budgeter you are or how efficient you are at controlling your operations, your actual results are always going to differ from what you budgeted for. And that is the case with Mad Cleaning here at the end of January. At the end of January, they're going to have actual results which are different than the numbers that we budgeted for. And they're going to have to figure out exactly why it is that those numbers didn't line up with what they planned. They're going to do so by preparing a flex budget performance report. So the first thing that you need for a flex budget performance report is all of your actuals, as they call them, the actual amount of units that you moved or your actual revenues, how much you paid for each of your cost components, or in other words, what were your total variable costs actually, leading to your actual contribution margin, and then what fixed costs did your company incur as well, ultimately leading to the actual amount of operating income that you experienced during the period. Well, that number is provided for us. All those numbers are. We have all of Mad Cleaning's actual results. The second thing we need is our standards, which is how much we proposed we were going to sell each unit, in this case bottle, of all-purpose cleaner for, and how much we expected each one of those to cost us in variable costs, what our direct materials, direct labor, and variable overhead were for each unit that we produced. So we have all of those standards that were set forth that we already used to prepare our master budget in the first place. Well, now that we have our actual results and how much we were intended to sell and spend producing each unit, we need to analyze our variances. And let's start doing that by filling in the static budget, the rightmost column on our flex budget performance report. The first line that we have is the number of units sold in terms of bottles. We actually sold 10,500 bottles of all-purpose cleaner, but that is not the amount that we budgeted for. What was our expected level of sales? Well, we can find what that was if we go back to our sales budget. We expected to sell 10,000 bottles during the period. Sales revenue. What was our expected sales revenue? According to our master budget, we made a budget for that. We have a revenue budget. If we go back to our revenue budget, we see that on our sales revenue budget, we expected to generate $80,000 in sales revenue from the sales of those 10,000 bottles because we were selling them at $8 a piece, which again would be our budgeted number of units sold times our budgeted amount per unit. Well, what would it have cost us? Well, according to our direct materials budget, if I go back here, we're going to use 2 pounds of direct materials for each bottle of all-purpose cleaner. And each one of those pounds of material was going to cost us $1, so those 2 pounds for each bottle was going to cost us $2, which is how we came up with that $2 standard, which means producing those 10,000 bottles at a rate of $2 a piece should have cost us $20,000. And we have that in our direct material budget too. Our direct materials needed for production at cost was 20 grand. So if we go back to our FBPR over here, our flex budget performance report, we can fill in our direct labor and our variable overhead in the same exact way. We budgeted to sell 10,000 units. Each one was going to cost us $2 in labor. So our expected direct labor cost for the period was $20,000. Let's go to our direct labor budget and see if that number jives with what we have here. Sure is. Our budgeted total direct labor cost for $20,000. For our variable overhead, to make those 10,000 units, also at a rate of $2 per unit, we would have spent $20,000 in variable overhead costs. Let's go to our manufacturing overhead budget and see if that number jives. Right there, our total budgeted variable overhead costs were $20,000, which means that in total, our total variable costs of production were the costs of materials, labor, and overhead. We proposed that we were going to spend $60,000 in variable costs to produce the goods, which we're going to ultimately turn around and sell for $80,000. So our budgeted contribution margin in total was 20 grand. We were budgeting to have a total contribution margin of 20,000. That was our variable cost. What about our fixed cost? Well, what was our budgeted fixed manufacturing overhead? Well, we have a manufacturing overhead budget. If we go and reference it, we see that our total budgeted fixed overhead, according to our manufacturing overhead budget, was 3,000. And then we also had fixed selling and administrative expenses, which we can find on our S&A budget. So if we go there, we see our total budgeted fixed S&A expenses were also 3,000, which means in total, we expected to incur $6,000 of fixed costs. And since contribution margin minus fixed costs equals operating income, 20,000 minus 6,000 is going to give us our $14,000 in operating income. So we have what actually happened versus what we budgeted for. And at this point, we should be pretty happy. We did more than $2,500 in extra operating income over what we budgeted for. And for a lot of people, you would see that, you'd be like, okay, that's good, we're good to go, I don't need to do anything else. But if you want to be a sufficient manager through the numbers, there's always room for improvement. You always want to figure out why. Why did we do so much better? How did we get to that point? Did we, save a ton on materials? Did our employees get the job done way faster than we thought they were going to? We had to pay less for hours. Did some of the overhead costs we expect to incur actually not happen, or did we pay less for them than we thought we were going to? There could be tons of reasons. So to be a better manager, we need to do a variance analysis on why we have this $2,529 difference between the amount of income we budgeted for versus the actual amount of operating income we generated. And to start doing that, you need to fill in a flex budget column. And to fill in your flex budget column, you simply start by copying over the actual number of units which you sold during the period. We sold 10,500 bottles of all-purpose cleaner. I like to call the flex budget the what should have been budget. It is what should have happened based upon the actual number of units we produced and sold. If we had all of our standards be accurate, if we paid $2 a bottle for direct materials, we paid $2 a bottle for direct labor, this is what we should have spent. Well, if we sold these for $8 a piece and we sold 10,500 of them, what should we have generated in sales revenue? You can take the 10,500, multiply it by the $8 per piece budgeted selling price per unit. We should have had revenues of 84,000. We actually had revenues of 85,000. So we got a difference there. Let's move on and do our cost components of manufacturing, starting with direct materials. If we made 10,500 bottles and sold them, and each one did in fact cost us $2 a piece in materials to make, we should have spent $21,000 on direct materials. For those 10,500 units we actually sold, if we had our budgeted labor cost per bottle of $2 be accurate, that means that the 10,500 bottles we sold at a rate of $2 per bottle should have caused us to incur $21,000 in direct labor costs. And those 10,500 bottles that we actually sold at a rate of $2 per bottle for variable overhead means that producing those 10,500 bottles, which eventually got sold, should have caused us to incur $21,000 in variable overhead costs. Well, if we should have paid $21,000 for direct materials, $21,000 for direct labor, and $21,000 for variable overhead, then our total variable costs should have been $63,000. And if we did the $84,000 worth of revenues we should have generated and subtract out the $63,000 of variable costs we should have incurred, that means that our contribution margin should have been $21,000 for the month of January. What about our fixed costs? Well, what the flex budget column does is it adjusts the amount that you should have brought in or should have paid based upon the level of production and ultimately sales that your company did. Well, for fixed costs, the change in the level of sales that we did shouldn't have mattered. They're fixed. We would have paid $3,000 in manufacturing overhead, our budgeted amount, regardless if we sold 1,000 bottles or 100,000 bottles. They don't change with volume. So for the fixed cost portion of your flex budget, it should have been the same thing that you budgeted for in the static budget, which means our fixed manufacturing overhead should have been $3,000, and our fixed S&A expenses should have also been $3,000. We should have incurred a total of $6,000 in fixed costs. And since operating income is contribution margin less your fixed costs, we should have generated operating income of $15,000 during the period. Well, that's not what happens. Now we need to figure out the difference between our actual and our static, which can be attributed to the fact that we did sell more units, 500 more units than we thought we were going to, and the difference which can be attributed to anything else, our flex budget variance. And to do that, you just fill in the gaps. So if our sales revenue should have been $84,000 based upon the actual number of units we sold of 10,500, well, that is $4,000 more than what we proposed in the static budget. So $4,000 of our increase in sales revenue can be attributed to the fact that we sold more units than we thought we were going to, which is always a good thing for the company. That is a favorable variance. And to denote that it's a favorable variance right now, you would typically put an F next to it, but I'm going to use this little formatting thing in Excel right here, the good format. That is good for us, so I'm going to turn it green. Green means good. Let's keep on going down the line. For direct materials, we should have paid $21,000 in direct materials. We budgeted for $20,000. Well, that's $1,000 more in direct materials that we should have paid, and paying more in costs is not good for the company, so that has to be an unfavorable variance. I'm going to use the bad formatting. Red means unfavorable, so that is an unfavorable variance. And by that same logic, the difference between our flex budget amount and our static budget amount for both variable overhead and direct labor is $1,000, and they're all higher in the flex budget account. So that means that we have an unfavorable variance. We would have had to pay more in costs. When you think about it, it makes sense. You're gonna have to pay more to make more units that you eventually sell. And since we sold more bottles than we had planned for, we have had to have incurred more manufacturing costs to do so. So $1,000 of the increase that we paid in direct materials, direct labor, and variable overhead, respectively, can be attributed to the fact that we just had to make more units, which means we had to incur more costs. So for our variable costs, in total, they should have been $63,000. We budgeted for $60,000. That's $3,000 more. It's an unfavorable variance. $3,000 of the increase in our total variable costs can be attributed to the fact that we made more units, which, luckily for us, should have led us to generating $1,000 more contribution margin than we planned for in our static budget. Contribution margin is a measure of income. The higher your income is, the more favorable it is for your company, which means that's a favorable variance. Our flex budget says we should have spent $3,000 for fixed manufacturing overhead, the same amount we had in our static budget, and also true for fixed S&A expenses. We should have spent $3,000, the same amount in our static budget variance. That means both of these numbers, these variances, are going to be zero, and that's always true. Your sales volume variance for any fixed cost should always be zero, because you can't attribute an increase or a decrease in fixed costs to the fact that you made more units than you thought you were going to, because they should not change with your level of production. So your total fixed costs, by that same logic, is going to have a variance of zero. So what happened to our operating income? Well, our flex budget says we should have generated $15,000 of operating income. We proposed in our master budget, our static budget, that we were going to generate $14,000. Well, that's $1,000 more. So $1,000 in the total increase of our income can be attributed to the fact that we just sold more bottles than we thought we were going to. We had a favorable sales volume variance for operating income of $1,000. So that is the portion of the difference between what actually happened and what we proposed in our master budget that can be attributed just to the fact that you never know exactly how many units you're going to sell. We sold more units than we thought we were going to during the period. We should be happy about that. And that is the rationale for this. Now the flex budget variance column over here, that's everything else. That can be all the measures of cost. Did you sell these units for more or less than you thought you were going to? Did you spend more or less to produce these units than you thought you were going to? Can also be measures of efficiency. Did you have to use more materials to produce these bottles of all-purpose cleaner than you thought you were going to? Did it take your employees more hours to produce these goods? Even other things, did machines break down more than you thought they were going to and needed to be repaired? Flex budget variance is literally everything else besides the fact that you sold more units than you thought you were going to. So for sales revenue, we actually had $85,000 of sales revenue versus the $84,000 we should have. That's a $1,000 increase in more revenue. Always good for the company. It's a favorable variance. So $4,000 of the $5,000 difference between what we budgeted for and what actually happened can be attributed to the fact that we sold more units than we thought we were going to, and the other $1,000 can be attributed to anything else. For direct materials, we actually spent $20,475 on direct materials, while our flex budget says we should have spent $21,000 on direct materials. So we actually spent $525 less than we should have. And spending less to produce units is always a good thing for your company. It saves you money in the long run. That's a favorable variance. For direct labor, we actually spent $19,796 to produce these bottles of all-purpose cleaner. Our flex budget column says we should have spent $21,000, which means we spent $1,204 less than we should have. And spending less, always favorable. For variable overhead, we actually incurred $22,000 of variable overhead, but we should have incurred $21,000 according to our flex budget, which means we spent $1,000 more in variable overhead costs than we should have. And that can be attributed to a bunch of different things. Maybe we had to use more indirect materials than we thought we were going to. Maybe we paid more for indirect materials than we thought we were going to. And the same thing could be true for indirect labor as well. Cost of custodial staff, security guards, etc. So for our total variable costs, we ended up actually paying $62,271 in variable costs. Well, our flex budget says we should have spent $63,000, which means we spent $729 less than we should have. Great for our company. We spent $729 less in variable costs, therefore we have a very favorable flex budget variance for our variable costs. What about our contribution margin? Well, after we accounted for the variable costs of production, we had $22,729 in actual contribution margin left over towards covering our fixed costs. Well, our flex budget says we should have only had $21,000, which means we had $1,729 more in contribution margin than we thought we were going to, given how much we thought we were going to sell each bottle for and how much we thought it was going to cost us to produce each bottle. That is a favorable variance. And then for our fixed variances, well, we actually incurred $3,000 of fixed manufacturing overhead. Our flex budget says we should have incurred $3,000 of fixed manufacturing overhead. We didn't have any variance. We nailed that number perfectly. We made a guess on what that number was going to be, and it just so happened that it ended up being perfect. We have zero variance right there. Weren't quite as good for our S&A fixed expenses. Our actual fixed selling and administrative expenses were $3,200. Flex budget says we should have only spent $3,000 on fixed selling and administrative expenses, which means we spent $200 more on those expenses than we should have, which means we have an unfavorable flex budget variance for our S&A expenses. And in total, for our fixed costs, we incurred $6,200 of actual fixed costs versus the $6,000 our flex budget column says we should have incurred. We had a overall $200 unfavorable fixed cost flexible budget variance. And then bottom line, our operating income was actually $16,529. Flex budget column says we should have had operating income of $15,000, which means our operating income was $1,529 more than we should have experienced, given again our actual level of sales and our budgeted amounts per unit. So that is a very favorable variance. So in total, our operating income was $2,529 more than we budgeted for in our master budget. Why? Well, $1,000 of that was caused by the fact that we sold 500 more bottles of cleaner than we thought we were going to. And the other $1,529 of that is because of anything else. We could have had a better selling price. We could have had cheaper manufacturing costs. We could have been more efficient in our production process. So on its own, the flex budget variance says anything else besides volume increase, but that doesn't really help you make a very informed managerial decision. So what you need to do now that you've determined your flex budget variance is break that down into what portion of that flex budget variance can be attributed to some kind of change in cost, and what portion of that flex budget variance can be attributed to some type of change in efficiency.